Imagine spending 15 years soaring through the skies, believing you were untouchable, only to have it all ripped away by one mistake, one message, one moment of arrogance. Captain Elliot Grayson thought he controlled his fate, but he never saw the storm coming. Was it justice or a takedown plan from the start? Buckle up, because this story is about to take off. Before we dive in, let us know. What time are you listening to this, and where are you? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. Elliot Grayson adjusted his tie in the restroom mirror at San Francisco International Airport. His reflection stared back, sharp uniform, silver wings pinned to his chest, a look of quiet authority. For 15 years, he had flown across the country, commanding cockpits with an air of confidence that few could question. But today, something gnawed at him. He stepped out into the crew lounge, where pilots and flight attendants milled about, sipping coffee and flipping through flight plans. The smell of burnt espresso mixed with the scent of jet fuel that always lingered in these halls. Elliot preferred routine, the predictability of it. That was the beauty of aviation. Numbers, procedures, control. But lately things didn't feel quite the same. Greg Daniels, his co-pilot for today's flight, sat at one of the tables scrolling through his phone. Elliot gave him a nod before grabbing a coffee from the dispenser. "Morning," Greg said, offering a brief smirk. Elliot sipped his coffee and sighed. "Morning." Greg glanced around before lowering his voice. "Got a long one today. San Francisco to Atlanta. Full flight." Elliot exhaled sharply. "Figures." He took another sip and leaned against the counter. "It's not just that, though. You notice how different things are getting?" Greg raised an eyebrow. "Different how?" Elliot hesitated before muttering, "Passenger lists, crew rosters, the whole damn thing. Feels like we're running a bus line these days." Greg chuckled, though it lacked sincerity. "Yeah, I guess things have changed." Elliot studied Greg's expression. The man was agreeable, but never too much. A survivor. The kind who knew when to keep quiet and when to nod along. Before Greg could respond, a firm voice cut through their conversation. "Captain Grayson." Maya Brooks, the lead flight attendant, stood near the entrance, clipboard in hand. She was always composed, always professional. Elliot straightened slightly. "Morning, Brooks." She glanced at the roster, then back at him. "We're boarding in 20. Just wanted to check in." Elliot nodded. "Everything in order?" "Yes," she said. "We've got a high-profile passenger in first class. Government official, though they didn't specify which department." Elliot scoffed. "Great. Some politician trying to throw his weight around?" Maya didn't flinch. "I wouldn't know, Captain, but I do know that every passenger on this flight deserves the same level of respect." Greg shifted uncomfortably. Elliot just smiled coolly. "Of course, Brooks." She nodded and walked off, her heels clicking against the tile floor. Elliot watched her go, irritation simmering beneath the surface. He turned back to Greg, muttering, "She ever give you that speech?" Greg smirked, but didn't answer. Elliot checked his watch. Time to head to the gate. As he grabbed his flight bag, he felt something stir in his gut. He didn't like the way things were shifting, and today, for some reason, he had a feeling this flight wouldn't be like the others. Elliot strode through the terminal toward Gate 37, the low hum of announcements and rolling suitcases filling the air. The routine was the same: pre-flight checks, last-minute weather updates, ensuring everything was set before takeoff. But something about today made his jaw tighten. When he reached the jet bridge, he glanced at the line of passengers boarding. Most looked like business travelers or families heading home. But as his eyes swept over the crowd, he noticed something. A significant number of them were black. His grip on his flight bag tightened slightly. Greg, walking beside him, noticed the change in his expression. "Something wrong?" Elliot exhaled through his nose. "Nothing." Inside the cockpit, Jordan Ellis, the first officer for today's flight, was already running through the checklist. Jordan was quiet, competent, the kind of guy who didn't make waves. Elliot respected that. "Morning, Captain," Jordan greeted without looking up. Elliot slid into his seat and started flipping switches. "Morning. Anything I should know?" "Smooth air at 35,000 feet. Some headwinds over the Midwest, but nothing major." Elliot nodded, comforted by the predictability of it. At least up here, in the cockpit, Everything made sense. The sound of laughter drifted in from the cabin. He glanced toward the door, where Maya Brooks was chatting with a group of passengers as they took their seats. She had that effortless way of making people feel comfortable. Elliot leaned toward Greg. "You noticed the passenger mix today?" Greg glanced over his shoulder briefly, then shrugged. "I guess." Elliot scoffed. "This is getting out of hand." Greg offered a neutral smile, the kind that didn't commit to anything. "Just a flight, man." Elliot didn't respond. As they continued the pre-flight sequence, a flight attendant stepped into the cockpit. "Captain, we're ready for pushback." Elliot nodded but then added, "Any VIPs I should be aware of?" The attendant hesitated. "Yes, sir. Passenger in 2A. Name's Nathaniel Carter, government official. That's all I know." Elliot's expression barely changed, but inside irritation flared. He had no patience for bureaucrats who thought they owned the skies. He turned to Maya, who was now standing near the cockpit door, adjusting her earpiece. "Any special treatment requests for our VIP?" Maya met his gaze evenly. "None. Just a regular passenger." Elliot smirked. "Let's hope he remembers that." Maya's expression didn't change, but there was something in her eyes, something that said she was reading between the lines. The attendant stepped away, and Elliot adjusted his headset. "All right, let's get this bird in the air." As the plane taxied toward the runway, Elliot exhaled slowly. Up here, he was in control. Everything else could wait. The Boeing 737 cruised at 35,000 feet, slicing through the sky with mechanical precision. In the cockpit, the steady hum of instruments filled the silence between conversations. Elliot settled into his seat, his fingers resting lightly on the yoke. His mind divided between the familiar routine of flying and the lingering irritation from earlier. Greg leaned back slightly, stretching his arms. "So, you ever flown with Carter on board before?" Elliot scoffed. "Not that I know of. Government types are all the same. Act like they own the place but can't even fasten a seatbelt without asking for help." Jordan, who had been quietly monitoring the autopilot, finally spoke. "You sure that's the case, Captain?" Elliot glanced at him. Jordan rarely engaged in casual talk, let alone questioned anything. "What's that supposed to mean?" Jordan kept his eyes on the controls. "Just saying. Maybe he's just here for a flight like anyone else." Elliot exhaled sharply. "Yeah, well, I don't like surprises, and I don't like the direction this airline is going." Greg, sensing the tension, changed the subject. "Weather looks clear all the way to Atlanta. Should be a smooth ride." Elliot grunted in acknowledgement but didn't shift his focus from the displays. Down in the cabin, Maya Brooks moved through the aisles, offering refills of coffee, answering questions, keeping things moving. She had spent enough years in this job to recognize the subtle shifts in atmosphere, the small moments that revealed more than words ever could. She had noticed it before the plane even left the ground. The way Elliot's expression had darkened when he scanned the passengers, the slight edge in his voice when he mentioned Carter. She had seen men like him before. They weren't always overt about their biases, but the signs were there. As she approached first class, she caught sight of Carter. He sat with a book open in his lap, but his gaze was distant, thoughtful. "Can I get you anything, sir?" she asked. Carter looked up, a polite but measured smile on his face. "No, thank you. Just enjoying the quiet." Maya nodded, then hesitated before lowering her voice slightly. "If you need anything, let me know." Carter studied her for a moment, then gave a knowing nod. "Likewise." Maya continued down the aisle, but the brief exchange sat heavy in her thoughts. Something about the way Carter had responded made her wonder. He had caught on to something, just like she had. Back in the cockpit, Elliot adjusted his headset. "I'm sending a report to dispatch. Passenger composition on this flight is different." Greg's brows furrowed. "You mean?" Elliot didn't let him finish. "Just noting trends. It's important for data, right?" Greg's discomfort was evident, but he didn't push further. Jordan, however, glanced at Elliot and then back at his controls, his silence saying more than words could. Elliot hit send, and below deck, in the system that routed messages to headquarters, that report found its way to the wrong set of eyes. Nathaniel Carter. And he was reading every word. Nathaniel Carter lowered his book slightly, his gaze shifting to the seatback screen in front of him, though his mind was elsewhere. He had spent years navigating bureaucracy, cutting through red tape, sitting in meetings where people said one thing but meant another. He knew how to read between the lines. And the message that had just been flagged in his system, that wasn't just a casual observation. Maya moved through the aisle again, but this time Carter's eyes followed her movement carefully. He had seen her earlier, the way she carried herself. Not just a flight attendant going through motions, but someone who noticed things, someone who paid attention. He pressed the call button. Maya arrived within seconds, her professional demeanor intact, but she could tell this wasn't a standard request. "Yes, Mr. Carter?" Carter's voice was quiet, measured. "How well do you know your captain?" Maya didn't react immediately. Instead, she glanced at the other passengers nearby, ensuring their conversation remained private. "I work with a lot of captains." Carter smirked slightly at her careful response. "You've been doing this long enough to recognize things most people ignore." He let that hang in the air for a moment before continuing. "I received a transmission, an internal report, unofficial but revealing." Maya's jaw tensed, but her face remained neutral. "I wouldn't know anything about that, sir." Carter leaned back. "Number. But I think you know what I'm getting at." She glanced toward the cockpit door, then back at Carter. "If there's a problem with the flight, I can assure you our crew is professional and fully capable." Carter studied her, then exhaled through his nose, as if making a decision. "All right, let's say I keep this to myself for now." Maya tilted her head slightly. "And if you don't?" Carter smiled. "Then Captain Grayson and I will be having a very different conversation when we land." Maya nodded once, understanding the weight behind his words. "If you need anything else, let me know." As she walked away, Carter tapped a quick message on his phone, forwarding the report to his personal system. He'd handle this carefully. Up in the cockpit, Elliot felt a shift in the air, though he couldn't place it. He was still riding the mild satisfaction of having filed his report, believing he was just making an observation, keeping things professional. But he had made a mistake. He had forgotten that power in the air didn't belong to pilots alone, and Nathaniel Carter was about to remind him of that. Elliot adjusted the throttle slightly, eyes fixed on the horizon. The aircraft hummed smoothly through the sky, but there was an unease settling in his chest. He was a man who lived by routine, by precision, by knowing exactly what to expect. And yet something about this flight, it wasn't turbulence, but he could feel it. Greg sat beside him, unusually quiet. Even Jordan, normally indifferent to cockpit chatter, seemed more focused than usual, his fingers lightly tapping against the control panel. Elliot didn't like that. It meant something was off. Finally, Greg spoke. "You ever get the feeling someone's watching you?" Elliot stiffened, his grip tightening on the yoke. "What are you talking about?" Greg gave a slow shrug, keeping his tone casual. "Passenger in 2A Carter. Guy hasn't said much, but he's paying attention to everything." Elliot forced out a chuckle, but it was empty. "He's a government guy. They're always paranoid." Greg nodded, but didn't seem convinced. "Just something to keep in mind." Elliot scoffed. "I'm running this flight exactly the way I always do. There's nothing to keep in mind." Jordan finally spoke, his voice even. "That report you sent, dispatch doesn't usually route those mid-flight, but someone read it, and that someone is sitting in first class." Elliot's stomach twisted, but he kept his expression neutral. "What are you saying, Ellis?" Jordan turned his head slightly, his eyes unreadable. "I'm saying we might be the ones being evaluated, not the passengers." Elliot let out a quiet breath, trying to keep his irritation in check. "We do our jobs, we land the plane, and we move on. That's it." But even as he said it, the words felt hollow. Down in the cabin, Maya moved through the aisles, but her thoughts were preoccupied. She had spent years working with different pilots, different crews, and she had seen all kinds of personalities in the cockpit. Some confident, some arrogant, some careless. But Elliot Grayson, he was something else. She had noticed the way his jaw clenched when he looked at the passenger list, the way he barely acknowledged certain travelers, the way his tone shifted when he spoke to her. It wasn't always in the words. It was in the pauses between them. And now Nathaniel Carter had noticed too. As she passed first class, Carter caught her eye. He didn't call her over this time, but the look was enough. A silent question, a warning. She nodded once, barely perceptible. She understood. Elliot checked the fuel reports, trying to push away the nagging feeling at the back of his mind. The problem with flying was that once you were up here, you were locked in. No way out until touchdown. And for the first time in a long time, he wasn't sure how this flight was going to end. Elliot tapped his fingers on the throttle, his mind racing despite the rhythmic beeping of the flight instruments. The cabin remained quiet, the steady hum of the engines filling the air. But inside the cockpit, an invisible storm was brewing. Greg glanced at him from the co-pilot's seat, his usual casual demeanor now laced with unease. "You think we should say something to dispatch? Just to check?" Elliot exhaled sharply, his patience thinning. Check what, exactly? That some bureaucrat in first class decided to monitor a standard flight? Greg hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "I just mean, if Carter's someone important enough to have access to our internal reports, maybe he's here for a reason." Jordan, silent as ever, turned his gaze from the autopilot controls and finally spoke. "Or maybe he's here because of us." Elliot turned sharply. "That's ridiculous." But even as he said it, he wasn't sure if he believed it. Down in the cabin, Maya Brooks carefully balanced a tray of water glasses as she made her way down the aisle. Her movements were controlled, measured, but her mind wasn't on the task at hand. She had felt the shift in the air, like a string being pulled tighter and tighter, waiting to snap. As she reached first class, she stopped by Carter's seat. He wasn't reading anymore. His book was closed, his attention focused on something else entirely. He looked up, his expression unreadable. "I assume you know about the report." Maya kept her voice neutral. "I don't deal with internal communication, sir." Carter smirked slightly, as if he appreciated the careful response. "But you do notice things." She said nothing. Carter exhaled, rubbing his temple as if weighing his next words. "You've worked with Captain Grayson before?" Maya hesitated, then nodded. "A few times." "And in your professional opinion?" Carter leaned forward slightly, his voice quiet. "Would you say he's fit for this job?" Maya's fingers tightened around the tray handle. She thought of Elliot's subtle reactions, the way he seemed to believe he was untouchable, the way he had looked at her and at the passengers, like they didn't belong. She met Carter's gaze. "I would say he doesn't adapt well to change." Carter gave a slow nod as if confirming something he already suspected. "That's what I thought." In the cockpit, Elliot's headset crackled to life. "Sky West Atlantic 212. Upon landing, you are to report directly to the operations office. A representative will be meeting you at the gate." Greg turned to him, concern flashing across his face. "That's not normal." Elliot's grip tightened on the yoke. It's not." Silence stretched between them. Then Jordan spoke again, his voice low but steady. "I think Carter's about to make his move." Elliot didn't answer. He just stared at the endless blue horizon ahead, knowing that when they landed, his world might never be the same again. The flight had been smooth, but inside the cockpit, Elliot could feel the weight of something pressing down on him. The kind of weight that had nothing to do with altitude or air pressure. The message from dispatch still echoed in his head. Report to the operations office upon landing. He had flown thousands of hours, countless routes. But this was different. Greg stole a glance at him, shifting in his seat. "You think it's routine?" Elliot forced a chuckle. "Nothing about this feels routine." Jordan, steady as ever, continued monitoring the approach. "They wouldn't ask us to report if it was nothing." Elliot clenched his jaw. They wouldn't pull a pilot in just because some government pencil pusher didn't like his in-flight service. Greg exhaled, eyes fixed on the instrument panel. "Unless that pencil pusher has more power than we thought." In the cabin, Maya moved through the aisles, securing the galley for descent. The passengers were calm, unaware of the quiet storm brewing behind the scenes. But she knew. She had spent the last hour watching Nathaniel Carter, watching the way he sat still, composed, but always watching. He wasn't just a passenger, he was waiting for something. As she passed by first class, Carter caught her eye. "We'll be landing soon," she said, keeping her tone polite. Carter nodded. "I assume the captain is aware he has an appointment waiting?" Maya hesitated before answering, but she already knew the truth. "Yes, sir. He knows." Carter gave a thoughtful nod, then glanced toward the cockpit door. "Good." Maya held his gaze for a second longer before stepping away. The quiet tension in the air felt heavier now. She had no doubt. When they landed, something was going to change. Elliot guided the aircraft smoothly into descent, his fingers steady on the controls. But his mind, it wasn't on the landing, it was on what came next. The Atlanta skyline stretched ahead as the runway came into view. The tower cleared them for approach, their final descent beginning. He could feel it now, the slow unraveling of control. He had been at the top of his game for years. He had commanded respect, dictated the pace. But at this moment, for the first time in his career, he wasn't sure who was in control anymore. And that feeling, it made his stomach turn. Greg adjusted his headset. "Welcome to Atlanta." Elliot exhaled, gripping the yoke tighter than necessary. "Yeah, let's see what kind of welcome it really is." The plane touched down smoothly, but the real turbulence was just beginning. The wheels touched down on the runway with a smooth thud, but inside the cockpit, the tension remained sharp. Elliot's fingers hovered over the throttle as the plane decelerated, the familiar rhythm of landing feeling oddly disconnected from reality. The control tower's voice crackled through the headset. "Sky West Atlantic 212, taxi to gate B17. Operations team will be awaiting your arrival." Greg shot Elliot a quick glance, his usual easygoing demeanor gone. "They don't usually wait for us at the gate." Elliot kept his expression neutral. "No, they don't." Jordan remained silent, though his posture was stiff. He had seen enough to know when something was off. And this wasn't normal. Elliot guided the plane toward the gate, watching the airport staff moving around the tarmac. But it wasn't the usual ground crew that caught his attention. Standing just beyond the jet bridge, flanked by two airline executives, was Nathaniel Carter. He was waiting. Inside the cabin, Maya Brooks unlatched the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Atlanta. Please remain seated until we reach the gate and the seatbelt sign is turned off. Thank you for flying with us." She kept her tone professional, but her stomach twisted slightly. She had seen Carter standing there too. As she walked through first class, she met his gaze. Carter didn't smile, didn't nod. He simply acknowledged her with a glance, as if everything was unfolding exactly as he expected. Maya kept moving, but she could feel the shift in the air. The aircraft came to a full stop, and Elliot flipped the switches, shutting down the engines. But even as he went through the motions, he knew this was different. A soft knock on the cockpit door made Greg and Jordan exchange looks. Elliot exhaled, then reached over and opened it. Maya stood there, her expression unreadable. "Operations is waiting for you," she said, her voice even. "Nathaniel Carter is with them." Elliot's pulse ticked up slightly, but he didn't let it show. "Of course he is." Greg shifted uncomfortably. "Maybe this is just a debrief, a check-in." But Jordan, ever the observer, simply said, "It's not." Elliot unbuckled his harness, rolling his shoulders as if preparing for a fight. "Well then," he muttered, grabbing his flight bag, "let's see what the hell this is about." As Elliot stepped onto the jet bridge, the first thing he noticed was how still everything felt. The usual hustle of deplaning passengers, the chatter of crew members, it was all background noise compared to the figures waiting for him. Nathaniel Carter stood with his hands in his pockets, his stance calm but firm. Beside him were two senior executives from Sky West Atlantic. Their expressions were polite, but there was something else beneath the surface. Carter was the first to speak. "Captain Grayson," he said, his voice steady, "we need to talk." Elliot met his gaze, his jaw tightening. "I figured." Behind them, Greg lingered near the entrance of the jet bridge, keeping his distance. Maya, standing just inside the plane, watched silently. They all knew this wasn't just a conversation. This was something bigger, and for the first time, Elliot wasn't the one in control of it. Elliot squared his shoulders, gripping the strap of his flight bag tightly. He had walked through countless terminals, greeted passengers, shaken hands with executives, but this moment was different. There was no polite exchange, no nod of acknowledgement. Just Nathaniel Carter standing firm, flanked by two Sky West Atlantic executives whose expressions were unreadable. One of them, a woman in a dark blue business suit, gestured toward the terminal. "Captain Grayson, if you'll come with us." Elliot glanced at Greg, who suddenly seemed very interested in the floor. Coward. Jordan remained near the cockpit, watching but offering no reaction. Maya, on the other hand, stood just inside the cabin door, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. Elliot forced himself to smirk, masking the tightness in his chest. "This really necessary? I've had debriefs before, but this feels a little theatrical." Carter's face remained neutral. "It's necessary." Elliot exhaled sharply, then strode forward, following the executives into the terminal. The room they entered was nothing special, just another sterile operations office, the kind found in every major airport, but the tension inside was anything but ordinary. Carter took a seat across the conference table, motioning for Elliot to sit. The two executives remained standing, watching. Elliot dropped his flight bag onto the chair beside him, leaning back slightly. "All right, let's hear it." Carter folded his hands on the table. "You filed an internal report during the flight." Elliot didn't blink. "Yes, a report that specifically pointed out the demographic makeup of your passengers." Elliot exhaled through his nose. "That's an operational observation." Carter tilted his head slightly. "An observation?" Elliot nodded. "Passenger composition trends. It's relevant for airline analytics." Carter didn't immediately respond. Instead, he slid a printed copy of Elliot's message across the table. "These are your exact words." Elliot skimmed the page, but already knew what it said. "Too many of them. Feels like a different airline these days. Not what it used to be." Carter let the silence stretch. The female executive, who had been quiet until now, finally spoke. "Captain Grayson, do you understand why this is a problem?" Elliot kept his voice measured. "I was pointing out a shift in passenger demographics. That's all." Carter's eyes didn't waver. "What exactly was the concern?" Elliot forced out a laugh. "Oh, come on, this is ridiculous. Are we really sitting here dissecting a simple report?" The other executive, a man in his late 50s with a silver badge pinned to his lapel, leaned forward. "Captain, you weren't just making an observation, you were making a judgment." Elliot's stomach twisted, but he kept his face neutral. "That's your interpretation." Carter didn't blink. "It's the interpretation of this airline, and of the Department of Transportation." Elliot inhaled slowly. So that's what this was. A warning. He glanced at the executives. "So what now? Sensitivity training? A slap on the wrist?" The female executive's lips pressed together. "There's an ongoing review." Elliot's pulse ticked up. "Review for what?" Carter's voice was calm but firm. "For your future with this airline." Elliot's mouth went dry. This wasn't a warning. This was a threat, and for the first time he realized he might actually be in real trouble. Outside the conference room, Maya Brooks stood near the window, watching the planes taxi down the runway. She hadn't been invited into the meeting, but she didn't need to be. She already knew how this was going to end. And from the way Greg Daniels lingered near the gate, pretending not to be invested, she could tell. He did too. Elliot sat there, gripping the edge of the conference table, the weight of the words sinking in. A review. A polite way of saying his job was now under scrutiny. He had spent years in this cockpit, dedicated himself to this career, and now it could all be unraveled. Because of a damn email. Carter leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. The two executives exchanged glances, waiting for Elliot to say something, to defend himself, to plead his case. Instead, he scoffed. "So that's it? One internal message and suddenly I'm under review? I've been flying for 15 years." Without incident, the female executive, her expression firm, tapped a pen against the table. "This isn't about your record, Captain. It's about your judgment, your attitude. We have zero tolerance for discrimination, implied or explicit." Elliot's jaw clenched. "This is absurd. I was making an observation." Carter cut him off. "An observation about who? About passengers who bought tickets just like everyone else?" Elliot swallowed hard. "That's not what you meant." Carter's voice was quiet but sharp. "Then explain what you did mean." Elliot opened his mouth, then shut it. There was no answer that wouldn't make him sound worse. The silence dragged. The male executive finally spoke. For now, you're being placed on administrative leave pending the review. Elliot blinked. Leave? You'll be paid, but you won't be flying. Carter leaned forward. And if the review confirms what we suspect, you won't be coming back? Elliot's hands curled into fists under the table. This wasn't a warning. This was the first step toward removal. Maya Brooks walked through the terminal, her heels clicking against the polished tile. She didn't need to be in that meeting to know how it was playing out. She had seen enough of these situations before. Greg Daniels stood near the crew lounge, his back against the wall, his arms crossed. He looked up when she passed. Looks like they're giving him the talk, Greg muttered. Maya paused, tilting her head. And what do you think about that? Greg exhaled through his nose. I think Elliot's got a big mouth, and I think he's realizing he's not as untouchable as he thought. Maya studied him. And you? You were nodding along with him before takeoff. Greg smirked, but there was no humor in it. I nod along with everyone. Keeps me employed. Maya shook her head. Spoken like a true survivor. Greg shrugged. Better than going down with the wrong ship. Back inside the conference room, Elliot's ears were ringing. His whole body felt tense, but he forced himself to keep his expression even. This isn't over, he said, his voice low. Carter stood, smoothing out his suit jacket. No, Captain. It's just beginning. Elliot watched as Carter and the executives left the room, leaving him alone with the sinking realization. For the first time in his career, he wasn't the one in control. Elliot sat in the empty conference room, staring at the polished table, his fists clenched. The quiet hum of the terminal beyond the glass walls felt distant, like a world he was no longer part of. Administrative leave. The words echoed in his head, foreign and infuriating. He had given everything to this job, logged the hours, followed the rules. And now he was being treated like a liability. The door opened and Greg Daniels stepped inside, hands tucked into his pockets. He leaned against the wall, studying Elliot for a moment before speaking. Well, Greg said, exhaling, that could have gone better. Elliot shot him a sharp look. You enjoying this? Greg raised his hands in mock surrender. Hey, I'm just saying, it's not looking great for you. Elliot scoffed. You sat right next to me on that flight. Didn't say a damn word. Greg shrugged. Yeah, well, I know when to keep my mouth shut. Elliot's blood boiled at the casual betrayal. And now you're standing here like you didn't nod along with every word I said. Greg smirked. I nod at a lot of things. Keeps me out of meetings like this. Elliot wanted to punch something. Greg had always been a survivor, floating with the tide, never taking a stance. And now when it mattered most, he was watching from the shore, letting Elliot drown. Greg glanced at his watch. Look, man, I'd love to stay and chat, but I've got another flight in a few hours. Some of us still have a job. Elliot's jaw tightened. You're a real piece of work, you know that? Greg gave him an easy grin. I know. Then he was gone, leaving Elliot alone in the sterile room, the weight of his situation pressing down on him. Outside in the terminal, Maya Brooks stood by the crew lounge, sipping from a to-go cup of coffee. She watched Greg walk past, whistling softly like nothing had happened. She wasn't surprised. Greg had always been that way, floating where the wind carried him. He had no loyalty to anything but his own survival. She shook her head and turned toward the terminal windows, watching as ground crews prepared another plane for departure. A normal day, business as usual. Except for Elliot Grayson. He had spent years believing he was untouchable, believing his rank and experience shielded him from consequences. But today he was learning otherwise. Maya exhaled, tossing her empty coffee cup into the trash. She had no sympathy for him, not when she had spent her whole career proving she belonged in a space he believed was his by default. Elliot Grayson was finally facing something he couldn't outmaneuver, and she had a feeling he wouldn't handle it well. Elliot stepped out of the conference room, shoulders squared, his face impassive. The terminal bustled around him, indifferent to the fact that his entire career had just been put on pause. He moved toward the exit, his mind already calculating his next move. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Elliot sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The airport terminal loomed in his rearview mirror, its massive glass windows reflecting the fading light of day. He should have been prepping for his next flight, running through checklists, hearing the familiar chatter of air traffic control. Instead, he was here, suspended, humiliated, and powerless. His phone buzzed on the passenger seat. A call. He glanced at the screen. Unknown number. He hesitated, then picked up. Yeah? A smooth voice responded. Captain Grayson, I assume you've had better days. Elliot sat up straighter. Who is this? A pause, then, someone who knows how these things work, and someone who thinks you've been treated unfairly. Elliot's pulse ticked up. Go on. The voice remained calm. The media has been buzzing about your suspension. A few outlets are interested in your side of the story. Elliot exhaled sharply, rubbing his jaw. And why would I talk to the media? A soft chuckle. Because you're about to be buried. Carter's making sure of it. Sky West Atlantic isn't just suspending you. They're preparing to erase you. Elliot's stomach tightened. He knew airlines cut ties fast to avoid PR disasters, but hearing it confirmed made his blood boil. So, what are you offering? The voice didn't miss a beat. A chance to fight back. Elliot clenched his jaw. He had always played by the rules, believing experience and skill were enough to secure his place, but today had proven otherwise. The voice continued. We can get your story out, frame it the right way, make people ask if this was about fairness or about politics. Elliot stared at the terminal, watching flights take off without him. What's the catch? No catch, just a chance to remind the world who you are before they decide for you. A long silence stretched. Then finally, I'm listening. Meanwhile, back at the airport, Maya Brooks watched as the news broke. A leaked report, anonymous sources hinting at Elliot's suspension being part of a larger agenda. She frowned. That was fast. Nathaniel Carter sat across from her in the executive lounge, sipping a black coffee, his phone screen glowing with the same headlines she had just read. He didn't look surprised. Maya leaned forward. He's not going down quietly. Carter set his cup down. He never was. She exhaled. So what now? Carter smiled slightly, as if he had already anticipated this move. Now? He glanced back at his phone, scrolling through reports, seeing the narrative being twisted. Now we remind him who really holds the power. Elliot sat at his kitchen table, staring at his laptop screen as news headlines rolled in. Veteran pilot suspended amidst controversy. Sky West Atlantic faces backlash over internal report leak. Corporate overreach or political witch hunt? It was working. The narrative was shifting, just like the voice on the phone had promised. He had spent years believing the system protected men like him. Seniority, skill, experience. But now he realized the game had changed. Carter and the airline executives weren't playing fair, so why the hell should he? His phone buzzed again. This time it was a reporter from a conservative media outlet. He smirked, picking up. What can I do for you? The woman's voice was eager. Captain Grayson, we want to tell your story. People are calling this an attack on traditional values. They see what's happening here. Elliot exhaled, forcing a weary tone. It's bigger than me. I've given everything to this airline, and now I'm being discarded over a misunderstanding. She pressed on. Do you think this is about more than just one email? Elliot let the silence stretch before answering, carefully measuring his words. I think the industry is changing, and not for the better. That was all she needed. We'd love to have you on for a full interview. Let people hear directly from you. Elliot's smirk widened. Let's set it up. Back at Sky West Atlantic's headquarters, Nathaniel Carter watched the storm unfold. The news cycle was spinning fast, twisting the situation into something bigger than just one pilot. He wasn't surprised. He had seen this before. Maya Brooks sat across from him in the executive lounge, arms crossed. He's playing victim, Carter nodded. Of course he is. That's what people like him do when they lose control. She frowned. So what do we do? Carter took a sip of coffee, calm as ever. We don't react. Not yet. Maya raised an eyebrow. And why's that? Carter finally looked at her, a sharp glint in his eye. Because the louder he screams, the more mistakes he'll make. That night, Elliot stared at his reflection in the bathroom mirror. The interview was set. His side of the story was going out, but deep down he couldn't shake the feeling that Carter wasn't finished yet, and for the first time he wondered, had he underestimated his opponent? Elliot adjusted the collar of his shirt, glancing at himself in the mirror before stepping back into his living room. The lights from the camera crew flickered in his periphery, and the news anchor, sharp, polished, eager, sat across from him, microphone in hand. He had done interviews before, after big flights, record-breaking routes. But this wasn't about his skills as a pilot. This was about survival. The camera operator counted down, and then they were live. "Captain Grayson," the anchor began, her tone warm but professional, "your suspension has sparked outrage among many who feel this is part of a larger cultural shift. Some say experienced professionals like yourself are being sidelined in favor of new policies that prioritize optics over merit." Elliot nodded, feigning a weary sigh. "That's exactly right. I've dedicated my life to this industry. I've flown thousands of hours, trained new pilots, upheld the highest standards. And now, because of one internal message, one observation, I'm being pushed out." The anchor leaned in. "What do you think this is really about?" Elliot didn't hesitate. "It's about control. It's about reshaping the industry to fit a narrative. And if you don't fall in line, they'll find a way to remove you." He let the words hang, knowing they would land exactly where they needed to. The anchor's eyes gleamed with opportunity. "And who is they?" Elliot smirked slightly. "I think we both know." At Sky West Atlantic headquarters, Nathaniel Carter leaned back in his chair, watching the interview on his phone. The transcript scrolled at the bottom of the screen, every word carefully crafted to ignite outrage. Maya Brooks stood by the window, arms crossed. "He's making himself a martyr." Carter didn't look away from the screen. "Exactly." Maya frowned. "Then why aren't we responding?" Carter finally turned to her, his expression calm. "Because we don't need to." Maya raised an eyebrow. "You really think he's going to burn himself out?" Carter's lips curled into a small smile. "I don't need him to burn out." He tapped his phone screen, pulling up a folder labeled "Confidential." "I just need him to burn the wrong bridge." Maya stepped closer, glancing at the document Carter had opened. Her eyes widened slightly. "This is—" Carter nodded. He thought he was the one setting the narrative, but he forgot something important. Maya met his gaze. "Which is?" Carter smirked. "You don't pick a fight with someone who knows everything about you." Elliot closed his laptop after the interview, exhaling with satisfaction. The messages were already pouring in. Supporters, sympathetic voices, people who saw him as the last line of defense against the industry's changing tides. He had control again, or at least that's what he thought, because as he reached for his phone, a new email popped up. The subject line made his stomach drop. "Internal investigation findings, Sky West Atlantic." He hesitated, then opened it. His pulse pounded as he read the words. New allegations, old emails, statements from former colleagues, and at the bottom, one final sentence. "We will be moving forward with termination." Elliot's breath caught. This wasn't just suspension, this was the end. Elliot's hand tightened around his phone, his eyes locked on the email's last line. Termination. It wasn't a suspension anymore. It wasn't a warning. They were cutting him loose, permanently. His breathing slowed as he reread the details. Allegations, old messages pulled from company archives, statements from colleagues, people he thought were on his side. He clenched his jaw. This was Carter. The timing was too perfect. Right after his interview had gone live, right after he'd positioned himself as the victim, they had dropped the hammer. He shot up from his chair, pacing his living room. His mind raced, flipping through options. Could he fight it? Was there a legal angle? His phone buzzed again. Another email, this one from his attorney. Recommendation: settle quietly, do not escalate. Elliot let out a bitter laugh. Settle? Like hell. He had gone all in on his defense, convinced he could turn the tide. But now the tide had swallowed him whole. At Sky West Atlantic headquarters, Nathaniel Carter leaned back in his chair, watching the fallout unfold. The official termination had hit the press within an hour. News outlets were already shifting the narrative. Not about Elliot being a victim, but about his past, his pattern of behavior. Maya Brooks stood near the window scrolling through her phone. They're tearing him apart now. Carter nodded. That's what happens when you make too much noise. Maya exhaled, shaking her head. And Greg Daniels? He was right there with Elliot on that flight. Carter smirked. And yet Greg Daniels didn't send the report. Greg Daniels didn't go on television. Greg Daniels didn't challenge the system. Maya frowned. So he gets away with it? Carter took a sip of his coffee. Greg Daniels played the game right. Elliot Grayson didn't. Elliot's phone rang. He grabbed it, expecting his lawyer, but the number was unfamiliar. He hesitated, then answered. Yeah? A woman's voice, clipped and professional. Captain Grayson, I'm calling from an independent airline recruitment agency. Elliot's heart lifted slightly. Maybe, just maybe, there was a way back in. We've reviewed your case, and while your experience is impressive, we won't be able to move forward with your application at this time. The air left his lungs. The voice continued, polite but firm. We wish you the best of luck in your future endeavors. A click. The line went dead. Greg Daniels sipped a beer in a quiet bar near the airport, flipping through his phone. He saw the news about Elliot, the termination, the public fallout. He shook his head, muttering under his breath. Told you to keep your mouth shut, man. Then he put his phone away, finished his drink, and walked out. Unlike Elliot, he still had a flight to catch. Elliot sat in his darkened apartment, staring at nothing. He had always believed that experience, skill, and seniority would protect him. But he had been wrong. The industry had moved on. And he was grounded for good. Elliot sat in his darkened apartment, the glow of the television flickering across the room. He wasn't watching. He hadn't been for hours. The voices droning from the screen were just background noise, blending with the hum of his thoughts. His flight bag sat by the door, untouched since he had walked out of the airport for the last time. He should have unpacked it, but he couldn't bring himself to do it, because once he did, it was real. He reached for the glass of whiskey on the coffee table, staring at the amber liquid before downing it in one gulp. For years he had been someone, a pilot, a leader in the cockpit. He had dictated the skies, made split-second decisions that saved lives, commanded respect. And now he was just Elliot Grayson, former airline captain. His phone buzzed, the bright screen momentarily blinding him in the dim room. A message from an old contact at another airline. Sorry, man, not a good time. Maybe later. Elliot chuckled bitterly. There wasn't going to be a later. At SkyWest Atlantic headquarters, Nathaniel Carter sat in his office, flipping through reports on his tablet. The fallout from Elliot's termination had settled. The news cycle had moved on. Maya Brooks stood by the door, arms crossed. That's it then? Carter glanced up. That's it. She shook her head. I don't get it. Guys like him have been getting away with this kind of thing for years. Why did he go down so fast? Carter leaned back in his chair. Because he thought he was too big to fall. He thought experience alone was enough to protect him. But times change. Maya studied him. You almost sound sorry for him. Carter smirked. Not sorry, just familiar. Maya nodded slowly. So what happens now? Carter picked up his coffee. The airline moves forward, the industry keeps evolving, and Elliot Grayson becomes a name people almost remember. Maya exhaled, glancing out the window at the runways beyond. The world kept moving. The planes kept flying. Elliot stepped out onto his apartment balcony, the cool night air hitting his skin. Somewhere in the distance, he heard the faint roar of a jet climbing into the sky. His sky. Once he had controlled that world. Now he wasn't even a part of it. His fingers twitched, as if they were still gripping the throttle. But there was nothing left to hold on to. For the first time in years, he had nowhere to go. No flight plan, no destination, just the long descent into what came next. And he had no idea where that would take him. Power, privilege, and control. Captain Elliot Grayson thought he had all three. But the world doesn't stand still, and those who refuse to adapt eventually find themselves left behind. Was he a victim of a changing industry or the architect of his own downfall? That's for you to decide. One thing is certain, no one is untouchable, and the choices we make always come back to us. What do you think? Did Elliot deserve what happened to him, or was he unfairly taken down? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We're reading everyone. And if you love gripping stories that expose power, betrayal, and justice, hit that subscribe button and stay tuned for more. Because in this world, the truth is never simple.